And it is my pleasure to announce as our second speaker in this session, Patrick Sänger, after a PhD and a habilitation at the Vienna University, and after various stages in Heidelberg and in Kiel, he teaches ancient history at the University of Münster. And since 2022, he's also the chair or the boss of the Forschungsstelle Papyrologie at the same university which actually he inaugurated and organized. Patrick is an ancient historian with a very, very wide range of expertise and activities. He's an editor of papyri and inscriptions. He's also a team member of the excavations in Ephesus, and the focus of his research is on administrative and social history of Egypt and the Eastern Mediterranean from the Hellenistic period throughout to late antiquity. He's the author of an excellent book on 2 papyrological archives on veterans from the Severian period, and of an equally very important book on the Jewish and other polyteumata in Ptolemaic Egypt. The topic of his paper today is Alexander the Great. There's no PowerPoint, is this right? Okay. Alexander the Great and the Emergence of Hellenistic Egypt. So, Patrick, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Bernhard, for this very kind introduction. First of all, I would like to thank the organizers, Robert, Joachim, and as well as Astrid for their kind invitation to this marvelous conference in an environment that I strongly miss in Münster, where I'm living at the moment, namely a landscape with some serious mountains. So thanks for providing us with that breathtaking panorama. I would like to start my paper with stating that the title of this talk may be somewhat misleading. Given the topic of this conference, the point is obviously not to consider Alexander the Great a priori as a formative figure in the emergence of what classicists call Hellenistic Egypt. Rather, the issue is whether Alexander and his conquest of Egypt represented a watershed for that country in every respect, which is what the term Hellenistic Egypt might mean in dogmatic terms. The aim of this paper is to determine, from the perspective of administrative history, whether non-Graeco-Macedonian ruling principles, institutions, offices, or officials played a decisive role at the beginning of Hellenistic Egypt, and to what extent any inherited structures can be traced back to the former xenocracy of the Achaemenid Empire. Is administration then an area to which the attribute Hellenistic necessarily applies with or immediately after Alexander the Great, and do we need to pay attention to the Achaemenid prelude in this context? I would like to examine this question on the basis of 3 short case studies, all of which start with what we know about the Persian administration in Egypt and compare this with what we know from Hellenistic Egypt. First, by looking at the rough structure of the top level of the local administration, whose organizational basis were the districts or nomes into which Egypt had been divided from north to south since pharaonic times, a principle that neither the Persians nor the Ptolemies nor the Romans changed. Second, and following on from this by means of a look at the tax system that can be drawn for Persian Egypt. Thirdly and finally, I would like to point out parallels between the Achaemenids and the Ptolemies that relate to the administrative meaning of ethnic designations. Before I go into the case studies, however, I would like to make a few preliminary methodological remarks. When I raised the question at the start, and this is also written in the abstract to this paper, about whether administration is an area to which the attribute Hellenistic necessarily applies with or immediately after Alexander the Great, and whether we have to consider the Achaemenid prelude in this context, then I do not want to imply that such considerations have not been made so far. Researchers are well aware that upon conquering Egypt, Alexander and the Ptolemies inherited the centuries-old, indeed in some respects even millennia-old, administrative traditions cultivated in that country, which had been significantly shaped not only by Egyptians themselves, but also by Persian foreign rule. The idea of a Hellenistic Egypt that would have been subject to a Greco-Macedonian administrative order alone is absurd, especially against the background of pre-modern statehood. The fact that it is clear that, especially at the beginning of the Greco-Macedonian xenocracy, far-reaching processes of adoption and adaptation are to be accepted, and that this is especially true for the administrative sphere in order to keep the wheel turning and not to endanger the country's high tax revenue, does not, however, mean that precise work has been done on how to characterize the areas of overlap. An administrative historical approach that focuses on the transitional period between Pharaonic, Persian, and Greco-Macedonian rule has not yet been explored. This is manifested in the research literature currently available, which is devoted either to the Pharaonic, the Achaemenid, or the Ptolemaic administration, and in particular, implicitly makes the beginning of the Hellenistic period appear as a major rupture, without examining the actual character of the changes of rule and their mutual interdependencies. There is one exception to be sure, and that is the role of the Egyptian priesthood and the temple economy associated with them, which is of fundamental importance to the rule over Egypt and considered a trans-epochal phenomenon. Overall, however, there is a strong tendency toward the separation of a pre-Hellenistic and the Hellenistic sphere, which, especially in the context of administrative history, may stem from the fact that with Alexander the Great there occurred not only a lasting change of regime, which for the first time in its history connected Egypt with a sphere of power whose origin lay west of the Near East, but also a change of regime which brought about a change in the language of administration. Egyptian and, if one includes the Achaemenid foreign rule, Aramaic had become obsolete in this respect and were replaced by Greek. Thus, the administrative history of Hellenistic Egypt has been a subject dominated by researchers who have come from the tradition of classical studies, just as the pre-Hellenistic administrative history of Egypt has been the focus of Egyptologists and ancient Near Easternists. From a historical point of view, it is both paradoxical and understandable that so far hardly any fruitful bridges have been built between the two areas, the pre-Hellenistic and Hellenistic periods. Paradoxical because due to the masses of preserved papyri and ostraca, one will hardly find a better source situation for the study of administrative processes associated with the establishment and or replacement of foreign rule than in Egypt. And paradoxical because a lasting change of regime is nowadays in focus, at least where it marks the transition from the late Roman or Byzantine Egypt to Arab Egypt. understandable for the reason that the papyrological evidence for the period we are interested in, that is from the 6th to the 3rd century BCE, could be much better. Indeed, our evidence proves to be extremely disparate and painfully incomplete, especially where the late Egyptian period ends with the second Persian reign, and where, with the Greco-Macedonian takeover, we enter a transitional phase in the administration. We do not have a solid basis for an investigation of the Ptolemaic administration until around the middle of the 3rd century BCE, in the reign of Ptolemy II. That is more than a half century after the change of regime. In a comparison, therefore, we must largely content ourselves with contrasting the structures that we can grasp in pre-Hellenistic times with those whose more precise shaping in Hellenistic times we mostly know of only after Ptolemy I. That it is nevertheless possible to show certain lines of development, and that such an approach has potential, I hope to be able to show briefly in the following. Let us turn first, as indicated at the beginning, to the highest level of local administration. Here, a uniform model for the Achaemenid foreign rule that can be applied to the whole of Egypt cannot be drawn on the basis of the sources. However, Aramaic papyri from Elephantine, which date to the second half of the 5th century BCE, offer insights from which at least a general administrative pattern can be inferred. For example, the evidence shows that in Elephantine, the capital of the so-called southern district, which may possibly be considered a Persian innovation, a civilian and a military official headed the nome administration. The civilian official, referred to as the frateraka, probably stood hierarchically above the military official, who can be identified as the commander of the garrison or fortress of Syene, i.e. the site on the eastern bank of the Nile opposite the island of Elephantine. The pattern of a nome administration, which in the southern district was the responsibility of a civilian and a military official, is confirmed by a demotic papyrus from the Middle Egyptian Heracleopolite nome, which, however, already dates from the 26th dynasty, thus during the Said period. This means that the constellation that emerged in the southern district under Persian domination was already known in the Said period. The frateraka and the commander of the garrison or fortress of Syene are therefore not part of a genuinely Persian administrative model, but are probably based on older Egyptian models, albeit with the one difference that the offices in question, the civilian district head and the commander attached to him were under the Persian domination, held not by Egyptians but by Persians. Whether every Egyptian nome was organized in this way at the highest administrative level in the Persian period must remain an open question. It can, however, at least be said that what we know about the beginnings of Egyptian nome administration in Hellenistic times can certainly compared with the model just outlined. Here I would like to start with Diodorus, who, with reference to pre-Hellenistic Egypt, mentions a district head with civil administrative duties called the nomarchies. An official with this title, which one would like to link to the Egyptian office behind the frateraka, is also known from the Greek papyri. Indeed, in the first decades of Greco-Macedonian rule, until about the middle of the 3rd century BCE, there seems to have been a nomarchies at the head of the Egyptian nomes, who was, moreover, assisted by a commander known as the strategos. to whom the troops of the new occupying power stationed in a nome were subordinate. The separation of a civilian and military sphere of office at the highest level of the Egyptian nome administration, which was already observable in the Said period and which continued under Persian rule, can thus also be demonstrated for the early Hellenistic period, at least transitionally, because as early as the second half of the 3rd century BCE, the strategos, whose role had previously only been military, took over the civilian administration and supplanted the nomarchies. It is difficult to determine whether the office of nomarchies was filled only or predominantly by persons from the Graeco-Macedonian milieu. In the case of the military strategos, however, this is beyond question. I now come to the treatment of taxation that can be traced for Persian Egypt, and I will take a look at specific royal taxes that have recently been filtered out of the demotic evidence by Damien Agut-Labouder. The emphasis is indeed on treatment based on demotic evidence, because our knowledge of taxation in Persian Egypt also draws on Aramaic documents. However, a full consideration of all the available information and sources cannot be given here. Agut-Labouder records 4 text categories in his examination of the demotic material. First, a little understood harvest tax, perhaps payable in kind, levied at the nome level and payable by landowners. Second, another harvest tax, payable in kind at the communal level and by the actual cultivators of the taxed plots of land. Third, a transaction tax, payable in money on the transfer of priestly positions. And fourth and finally, a transaction tax, payable in money on the purchase of land owned by the temple of Amun at Thebes. The evidence is complex and can only be touched upon superficially here on the basis of Agut-Labouder's excellent considerations. First of all, it can be assumed that the taxes levied by the Persians largely, but not exclusively, originated with the Saids. And the reason for this is that a practiced and functioning system will not have been comprehensively reformed, especially where the revenues of a country are concerned. And this could not have been done at all with a small number of Persian administrators, which is essentially also true for the Graeco-Macedonian rule, at least in its early stages. Nevertheless, it could be the case that some aspects of these taxes involved Persian innovation. Since the district or nome chief may have been responsible for the collection of the taxes in kind, these revenues went directly to the government and so may have been set up by the Persians in this way. Especially in the case of taxes levied in money, Persian influence is to be suspected, perhaps in order to bring more money into circulation in the Achaemenid Empire. The transaction tax on the transfer of priesthoods may indeed have been a recent Persian introduction. And in the case of the transaction tax on purchases of land owned by the temple of Amun at Thebes, which incidentally can essentially be traced back to the 7th century BCE, i.e. to the Said period, it seems that under Persian rule the tax flowed to the temple but was collected by a royal representative, which might indicate that the amounts allocated to the temple could be claimed, wholly or in part, by the government. This consideration arises from a look at Ptolemaic documentation, which indicates government interference in the collection of taxes on temple land. And here, on the basis of a tax that can be traced back to the Said period, we find the first pivotal point for the fact that the tax policy taken up by the Persians that concerned temple land was also pursued in Hellenistic times. A connection between the Persian and Ptolemaic periods can also be established for the transaction tax on the transfer of priestly positions, which we later grasp in the Greek evidence as telestikon. We could probably also find connecting points for the taxes to be established in kind, such as the Ptolemaic harvest or land tax. But a more precise identification in this regard is not possible for the time being. Nevertheless, we see that also in the area of taxation, there is the possibility of uncovering points of contact that reach from the late period and Persian rule to the Hellenistic period. We have now arrived at my last case study, which concerns the administrative handling of ethnic designations, whose point of reference are often concrete regions or countries. When speaking of the latter, the countries, one thinks in connection with the Achaemenids of the much discussed lists of countries handed down in the context of Persian royal inscriptions, which are likely to be echoed in the lists of nomoi and armies in Herodotus and in other literary registers on the empire divisions of Babylon and Tris Paradeisos. The ideological content of such enumerations was taken up by Ptolemy III, for example, who in the famous Adulis inscription commemorating the Third Syrian War reports on his territorial gains on both sides of the Euphrates by means of an enumeration of countries, and thus ostentatiously places himself in the succession of Alexander the Great. And not only that, for Ptolemy III is referred to in the inscription as the Great King, thus establishing an unmistakable link to the Achaemenid kings. But this is not the direction I want to pursue in the proper sense. Rather, I'm concerned with the practical significance that ethnic designations had in everyday legal life. In this context, papyrological research has revealed the importance of ethnic classification patterns for the Ptolemaic administration. On the one hand, to highlight privileged population groups on the socio-fiscal level, whose members were grouped according to certain extra-Egyptian ethnics: Greeks, Jews, Arabs, or Persians. For example. On the other hand, there was an official order known from the middle of the 3rd century BCE, which stated that in legally valid documents or contracts, the parties had to list their patris or place of origin. Those who did not come from or were not attributed to the Egyptian milieu referred to a non-Egyptian region as their patris by means of an ethnic designation. What has been seen so far, but not put into a broader context, is the fact that in Aramaic contracts that have come down to us from Elephantine, the practice of identifying non-Egyptian contracting parties by means of an ethnic designation is also encountered. The designations Jew, Aramaic, Caspian, or Chorasmian are found. Did the Macedonians copy this identification principle from the Achaemenids? Considering that the Greek contract system can be considered underdeveloped in comparison with the Aramaic one until the 4th century BCE, this would be quite possible. However, one will not get beyond speculations at the moment. In view of all this, what answer can we formulate to the question, is administration then an area to which the attribute Hellenistic necessarily applies with or immediately after Alexander the Great, and do we need to pay attention to the Achaemenian prelude in this context? Certainly, the picture that has just been drawn is disparate as the underlying sources. Nevertheless, it is evident that the organization of the nome administration as well as the taxation and contract system provide fields in which connecting lines can be uncovered that reach at least from the foreign rule of the Persians to the Ptolemies. What is suggested here is how regimes, indigenous or foreign, and their official apparatuses overlapped, how elements lived on, and where, if necessary, modifications were made. When at the end of the 1980s, Jean Chuchot put forward the convincing consideration that the highest Ptolemaic official after the king, the Dioiketes, has its origin in an office that becomes tangible under the designation Senti in the Said period, then we find ourselves at the apex of manifold processes in which Persian foreign rule is involved, and which in sum yielded the system the Graeco-Macedonian rulers were able to develop further. As far as their starting position in Egypt and their administrative possibilities were concerned, Alexander and the first Ptolemies were in a situation no different to the Persians before them. So, administration of Egypt, at least in the first decades of after Alexander took the country, is Hellenistic because of the change of epoch, but not of its nature, which would not be possible at all. Against this background, we should realize that we can approach the character and genesis of the Ptolemaic administration, indeed the nature of this foreign rule, in a sufficient way only if we also take into account its prehistory. A prehistory in which the Achaemenids play a decisive role. Thank you for your attention.